What's the most shocking thing you found out about someone close to you? Story 1. An acquaintance, really. He was a friend of a friend. Our friend had a pool and would often invite us over for barbecues. We had a 2-year-old and I was heavily pregnant at the time. My husband was carrying our things and our daughter ran ahead of us. She had been there many times before and was comfortable. She didn't have her floaties on yet, and she ran and jumped straight into the deep end of the pool ahead of us. We all rushed, but the acquaintance happened to be by the pool, and he reached down and pulled her up. She raised her hand when she realized it was too deep. We ended up having a great afternoon at the pool, and we visited with this man who had grandchildren and was much older than us. We left with positive feelings about the day. My husband saw him more frequently than I did and played golf with him and his friend. We moved away about a year later and were shocked to learn that he had been arrested for hurting his own granddaughters. That has never left my mind. Story 2. My wife passed away 2 years ago at the young age of 49. A week later, I decided to go through her personal devices to see if there were any friends or family I still needed to contact. What I discovered instead was that my wife had been chasing after other men during our entire 12 years together. When she met me, she already had someone else she was infatuated with, but his life was too chaotic for her to consider him seriously. She was a single mom with 2 kids and needed stability. Still, she enjoyed the attention he gave her, constantly asking for her time. And there were other men she met online as well. Altogether, I counted 6 different people she had been involved with during our relationship. I stopped digging because each new discovery broke me even more. It did explain, however, why our relationship stopped growing after we moved in together. She lost interest in deepening things with me and only did the bare minimum to keep me around because I was supporting her and her kids. And because I genuinely loved her, I always hoped things would eventually get better between us. But they were never going to improve, only decline, because she was actively undermining our chances. Story 3. I don't know if it's the most shocking, but it was definitely shocking to me and something I still struggle with. My ex and I were together for over 20 years. I grew up very poor in a difficult household. My dad passed away when I was young, and my mom left with a man she met on the internet. My ex and I first dated when I was about 18. I pursued her for years, and eventually we started dating, moved in together, and built a life. Her dad was a doctor, and they were fairly well off. From the start, they welcomed me in as family. Her dad and I got along great, and I saw him as a father figure. He could be demanding, but I always made myself available, helping him with car projects, house remodels, trips, you name it. A couple of years after we moved to a new town for school, my ex cheated. We split up for 2 years, and during that time, I would sometimes drive back to our old town just to see her parents, maybe have lunch with them. Later, we got back together. A few years after that, I suspected she was unfaithful again, but never had proof. I always told her that I forgave her once, but if it happened again, we were finished. In the summer of 2020, during the pandemic, things fell apart. She started drinking heavily, partying, using substances, and disappearing to her parents' lake house for weeks. I eventually found out she was having an affair with someone she'd met at a bar. That was the end. The morning she admitted it, I had seen the messages on her phone after she passed out the night before. We had a long, emotional talk, and I told her I was leaving. I also said I would cancel her phone since it was under my plan. I wasn't going to pay for her to keep talking to him. She asked if she could call her parents quickly to explain and warn them she might be without a phone for a few hours. I was upstairs packing when I overheard her on speaker, telling her dad that we were done and she'd been seeing someone else. I will never forget his response. Good. I always told you I never liked him. I always told you that you could do better. That hurt more than her betrayal. He had been like a father to me. They were basically the only family I had known. I loved him and thought he loved me too. To hear that he never truly liked me has stayed with me ever since. Story 4. A high school friend became a multimillionaire through reposting memes on Instagram. He was a pretty ordinary guy, but had a great sense of humor and an ever-expanding meme collection. In between working at KFC, he was reposting memes on pages he made. Eventually, he sold an account for $10,000 and began managing 10+ huge accounts, cross-promoting them. He then started selling accounts for $50,000 every month or so. This was in the early days when Instagram first became a main meme hub, Around 2016, when its identity shifted, he eventually disappeared, cutting off most of his school connections. Nobody except his closest friend stays in contact with him. I'm still connected, and he's just traveling the world permanently now in his 20s. He can retire from memes. He managed to do this before it became highly competitive and automated. Now everyone is competing for internet meme attention, and thousands of botted pages automatically do the same thing. Story 5. My cousin got serious with a guy she was dating and wanted the family to meet him. She warned us that he'd been in prison and had a past with gangs and drugs, but he had been clean for a decade and was ready to settle down. He looked the part: gang tattoos, shaved head, silver teeth. He looked a decade older than he was and definitely intimidating at 6 feet 3 inches and around 275 pounds. That being said, he is absolutely the nicest guy. Very kind, respectful, and obviously in love with my cousin. She had been dealt a tough hand, an absent father, a chronically ill mother, and an ex-husband who abandoned her when she was pregnant. To see her with someone who adored her and was so wonderful with her daughter made us all happy. He had taken administrative classes while in prison and used them to work his way up to a supervisor position at a local hospital. He runs outreach programs at the juvenile detention center. After he and my cousin got married, he adopted her daughter, and now they have a little boy who's almost a year old. People can look a certain way, and we can expect their behavior to reflect that. But Joaquin taught our family that people can change if they are truly motivated. He's an amazing man, and my cousin is so happy. They deserve all the good things in the world. Story 6. Mid-1990s. I came home from my honeymoon to find a card in my front door from the FBI. My neighbor across the hall popped out and asked if everything was okay because there had been a bunch of agents looking for me. Turns out my best friend of 5 years, who I thought had moved away to be with his girlfriend, was conning women around the country, robbing them blind, draining their bank accounts, and vanishing. He even stole their cars, drove to his next target city, and either sold the car to a chop shop or abandoned it. He left a jacket behind at one of his victims' houses, and in the pocket was my name and phone number. I went to the federal building in downtown Chicago, answered their questions, and convinced them I had no knowledge of any of this. After a few hours, I agreed to let them know if I ever heard from him. About 6 months later, he called me out of the blue. I said, "Hey man, how you been? Still in Minneapolis?" He replied, "No, that didn't work out. I'm back in Chicago." And he tried to sell me some stereo equipment. I told him I was good, but said we should hang out because I missed him. He was cautious, but eventually I convinced him to go play paintball with me. As long as I paid, that was normal in our friendship. I was well off and he usually struggled. I called the agent whose card I still had and said, "I'm playing paintball with him on Saturday in Gurnee." He just said, "Thanks, we'll keep in touch." Saturday morning, I picked him up in his old neighborhood. He looked stressed and thinner, but was happy to see me. We got to paintball around 9 a.m., played for a few hours, and then during a lunch break, 2 black SUVs pulled into the lot. My friend thought nothing of it, but it was suspicious. Then 2 of the guys we'd been shooting paintballs with turned to my friend and addressed him by his full name. I realized we'd been playing with undercover agents for 3 hours. They took him away in the SUVs, and I acted surprised, and I kind of was. I never heard from the FBI again. He spent 6 years in prison. My wife never liked him, and I despised him for what he was doing, especially since he tried to sell me stolen goods. Here's the kicker. One of his first victims was a girl from Joliet that he met while I was dating her. After she and I broke up, he pretended to meet her at her job in the mall. They dated, he stole her car and her savings, and disappeared. She was pregnant with his child, and that boy is about 30 now. Many years later, she reached out to me on Facebook, told me everything, and asked if she should tell her son about his father. I didn't know how to advise her, but she later told me that he died from hepatitis a few years after leaving prison. I looked up his funeral records. He had convinced his fiancée that he was a former SEAL Team 6 member, and she insisted he be buried with honors. And apparently that's what happened. That's how much of a manipulator he truly was. Story 7. My best friend since elementary school wasn't really my best friend. I was close with a couple of boys, call them Tony and Jay, who were twins. The 3 of us, along with a bigger group of friends, were inseparable for a long time. We went through elementary school, middle school, and high school together. Well, the summer between freshman and sophomore year, the twins went to Argentina to visit their ailing grandmother. Apparently, Tony decided he wanted to make the move permanent, but Jay wanted to come home. The thing is, while Jay was likable, Tony was always the more popular one, and I guess Jay was jealous. So he took over Tony's identity, and since they were twins, no one questioned it. It wasn't until later that things stopped adding up. Like Tony's stories about events that either didn't happen or that Tony wasn't part of, but Jay was. Or the things Tony didn't remember about his relationship with one of the girls in our group. She eventually decided to call the family in Argentina, and they swore both boys had come home. But where has the real Tony been? We don't know. Our theories range from Tony running away while in Argentina and Jay taking over his identity, to Jay doing something worse and then taking over. Either way, Tony isn't Tony. Story 8. I was a recently graduated therapist working in a forensics-heavy clinic. We were interviewing interns for placement as part of their graduate program. This was important because a lot of our clinical staff, myself included, were hired from internship. Many of the applicants were from the same graduate school I attended, so I knew quite a few of them personally. One of the applicants was a guy I'd had several classes with. He was taking the program part-time, so he had been in it when I started and was still there when I graduated. We'd had maybe 5 classes together. I knew him as very smart, but also sarcastic, a middle-aged guy who worked as a hairdresser outside of school at his boyfriend's salon. He was popular with classmates for giving free haircuts. He gave a great interview, and I was pretty sure he would be the one we hired, but we still had to wait for background checks. When those came back, we learned he had committed aggravated assault and a homicide when he was 18, spent 2 decades incarcerated, and was on lifetime probation. He had done his time, and I'm sure today he's an excellent therapist. But because we worked in a forensics clinic, and due to state regulations, we couldn't hire anyone on probation or parole for the clinical team. Story 9. My childhood best friend introduced me to a guy who seemed really nice. I even thought he was kind of cute. He had a whole giant sob story about his ex being a terrible mother and how hard it was for him to battle her in court for custody of their child. We hung out in groups over the next couple of years, but never alone. One night, he texted asking if I could swing by the bar they all loved to go to and drive him home since he'd been drinking and didn't want to risk a DUI. You know the story. The guy ended up assaulting me when I dropped him off. None of our mutual friends believed me, and none of my family took it seriously. It never got reported because everyone blamed me. Fast forward years later during the pandemic lockdowns. I was at home with my family when I got a text from a friend with a news article attached. It was about that guy. He had apparently lost control and attacked his girlfriend and was wanted for her killing. He was eventually arrested and is still on trial trying to use an insanity plea. I hope he faces justice. Story 10. Growing up, I had a best friend I met when we were 9, after he transferred to my elementary school. We did normal kid best friend stuff, and since my parents were awesome, I assumed that was the same for him. Years later in high school, he revealed to me that the reason he moved was because his biological father had tried to kill him, his mom, and their siblings. The stories that followed were horrific, but the one that truly shocked me was when he said he, his mom, and his sister went for a walk. And when they came back, the family dog was hanging from the ceiling, with his dad standing there smiling. He and I are no longer friends because he turned out to be a manipulative, narcissistic person, but his origin story definitely explained a lot. Story 11. My dad taught at different local universities on the side during his whole career. One of the professors, Fred, a decade younger, became very close to him. My dad had served as a Marine in World War II as a teenager toward the end. He was also German-American. Born and raised in NYC, he spoke German with his family. Fred would always hug my dad goodbye, and they mostly spoke in German together. Fred was Jewish, from Germany. As a child, he and his mother had to hide separately from the rest of their family. The idea was that his older brothers might have a better chance of survival without also having to worry about 6-year-old Fred and their mother. His sister was able to flee, but his father had already been taken. When things grew dire, Fred and his mom were hidden underground in a box, along with others. They were told they could last 3 days. The hope was that people could dig them out sooner, but the danger lingered longer than expected. Neighbors kept shovels ready and stayed nearby to help once it was safe. My dad and other German-American Marines were in the area at that exact time. All of them spoke German and blended in. When they arrived and saw digging starting, the neighbors panicked, thinking they were Nazis and they'd all be shot. Instead, my dad and the others helped. My dad personally helped dig Fred and his mom out. The idea that they had essentially been buried alive, depending completely on others to free them in time, shocked me to the core. I can't even imagine Fred's mom having to make that decision. In the end, Fred, his mom, his sister, and only one brother survived the war. My dad and Fred stayed in touch ever since. When we visited Germany, Fred's family treated us like royalty. When they came to the US, they always stayed with us. Once I learned how they had met, it all made sense. I used to think my dad was simply close with a colleague. But as a kid, I remember how, when we were in different parts of Germany, strangers would come up crying and hugging my dad. We would go into homes, I'd play with the children, and my dad would be with the adults. It was only later that I realized what those moments truly meant. Story 12. A neighborhood friend's little brother always seemed a little off, especially according to his big brother, who constantly teased him for having had bathroom accidents way past the age it would have been considered normal. To us, little brothers seemed nice and ordinary enough, so we figured the teasing was just an older sibling being cruel about some past illness or medical issue. We assumed Big Brother simply didn't want his younger sibling tagging along with us older kids. Whenever we called him out for being mean, he would insist, "He's just weird, okay?" But we still let little brother hang around with us anyway. Fast forward 20 years, and I hadn't seen or spoken to little brother in ages when he suddenly added me on Facebook. I was glad to see he seemed attractive, successful, and happy as an adult. But soon after, he began liking a bunch of my pictures, even ones with my husband and kids, and then started flirting with me. I told him I was married, but he kept going, so I blocked him for being disrespectful. Not even a week later, the entire old neighborhood was sharing shocking news. Little brother had been arrested in an FBI sting after trying to solicit women online in disturbing ways. Learning this sickened me for weeks, especially because I realized that the unsettling behavior he showed toward me was only a glimpse of something far worse. I guess Big Brother had been right all along. It makes me absolutely sick to think about. Story 13. My great-uncle passed away about a year ago, and while it wasn't unexpected, it devastated his family because he was an amazing man and 100% a family person. He had 2 kids who were the light of his life, and he was theirs. His son flew into town and was an absolute mess the whole weekend. He gave an incredible eulogy and spent the entire time sharing memories about his relationship with his dad and the love between them. A few days after the service, the subject came up in conversation with my mom. One thing led to another, and my uncle revealed that the son wasn't actually my great-uncle's biological child. Apparently, it was fairly well known that my great-aunt had an affair with a local cop, something my great-uncle somehow never knew about. There was a short separation, and when you do the math, the son was absolutely conceived during that time. He also looks nothing like his dad and 100% like the cop. It wasn't earth-shattering for me because I wasn't directly involved, and it was clear that no matter what, my great-uncle and his son had the bond of father and son. Whether he knew the truth or not, he treated that boy as his own. But it made me admire just how kind, gentle, and innocent of a man my great-uncle truly was, and also realize how reckless my great-aunt had been, since there were more stories about her behavior that surfaced. Story 14. One of my closest friends turned out to be hiding something awful. He had been hurting his stepdaughter and adopted daughter. When confronted, he ended his own life during a business trip. At first, his father told us he had died due to mental health issues. His wife didn't respond to calls or texts for a while, which we later understood. Many of us were left shocked, trying to make sense of how our fun-loving friend could suddenly be gone. I spent weeks feeling crushed, thinking I had missed signs of depression. Then my wife spoke with his wife, who told her the truth. I went from devastated to angry, just wanting to forget he ever existed. What confused me most was that he had never once talked about intimacy. He didn't joke about it, didn't join in when others did guy talk. We even thought he might be closeted, which would have been fine. When I first heard he had died, I thought maybe hiding that had been too heavy for him. Learning the real reason was a shock beyond words. His wife told me, "Don't blame yourself." I was his wife, and I had no idea he was capable of this. It's been 5 months, and I still can't process it fully. Another time, a coworker of mine killed his wife in a jealous rage. That still shocks me even now, 25 years later. Story 15. Most of these stories are really dark, so here's a good one. Back in the late 90s, I discovered that this humble older guy I hung out with at a local coffee shop had lived the most incredible life. He was funny, wise, and extremely chill. I'd heard rumors he had been an entertainer, but it turned out to be so much more. He once hired me and a few friends to help paint his garage. And while hanging out at his house, we found the most jaw-dropping collection of pictures and memorabilia. Over his life, he had been a World War II vet, a Harlem Globetrotter, a studio musician, and a character actor who had done small roles in movies and TV shows. He wasn't a huge star himself, but he knew everybody. He had photos of himself at parties and dinners with Robert Redford, Miles Davis, Richard Pryor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and many others. It was absolutely surreal to realize that this friendly old guy at the coffee shop had quietly lived one of the coolest lives I'd ever heard of. Story 16. My best friend and I met in the shelter system, and there was one staff member who seemed to have it out for us from day one. She was constantly mean, condescending, and always making comments or trying to get us in trouble. She especially disliked that we both needed accommodations for chores, since I have upper body mobility issues, and my best friend has a condition, EDS, that makes regular chores painful. She insisted we do them the normal way and accused us of lying to get out of work. Her hostility was so intense that we'd leave the site if she was on shift, just to avoid the stress. One night, after she practically forced us out with her behavior, my best friend angrily muttered that he wished we'd never have to see her again. We never expected that 2 weeks later, she would be gone, killed in a shocking incident. At first, staff said it was an illness or accident, but a friend looked into it and discovered the truth. She had been deeply abusive to her longtime disabled partner. After years of trying to leave and being coerced back, her partner finally snapped and shot her in public. Reading the article broke me. Her family had tried countless times to help, but she always managed to pull her partner back in with promises of change. We always sensed something was off about her and her attitude toward disabled people, but we never imagined she was living a double life as an abuser. Story 17. I used to be friends with this guy I met through work. I'd hang out at his place a lot, smoke, play video games, just chill with him and his family. Nothing about him seemed especially odd, other than the annoying habit of hooking up with my exes. He eventually settled down with his kid's mother, and we drifted apart. Years later, I found out what he'd done. He lured a woman to his house with the promise of drugs. Then he, his girlfriend, and another friend abducted her. They held her captive for a week, solely assaulting her, until she managed to get hold of a phone, escape, and call the police. It shocked me to my core. It was a brutal reminder that sometimes you never really know who people are or what they're capable of. Story 18. Anna Langford saved my dad's life. She was friends with my grandma back in the day, and she represented my dad in a case where he almost got sent to jail for breaking and entering with his friends. One of his pals had a dad who worked at a department store in Chicago. After hours, my dad drove the getaway car and helped them move some stuff. Typewriters, since at the time a lot of high schools and colleges needed them for typing classes, and small businesses had secretary pools. Big deal back then. He said he doesn't know what Grandma said or did when she met up with the cop, but his record is clean. It was the turning point in his life that made him go straight. He spent 30-plus years at the same job, barely ever called in sick, and retired in 2006 as assistant plant operations chief at Chicago State University. Anna Langford advocated for my dad, and he took the chance to become a better person. I'm so proud of him. As a kid, I thought my dad had always been perfectly responsible, never having done a bad thing. But the stories that came out explained a lot. He had the nerve to tell me to cut the malarkey like he hadn't been up to his own nonsense when he was younger at all. Turns out, from his teenage growth spurt in 1965 until he married Mom in 1978, he was both. Extremely responsible when it counted, but also wild in his own way. I call him now and we laugh about things most people wouldn't expect a daughter and dad to talk about. And I'm forever grateful for the woman who saw my dad's potential. He hadn't been a bad kid. He just wanted to hang with his friends, but his friends weren't the best influence. Most of them didn't make it. His oldest buddy eventually got sober to take care of his wife. Another straightened out after that night and kept a steady job for 30 plus years. And Mr. Ferg, the tall, lanky one, he literally ran from the trouble that night and lived to laugh about it later. Story 19. There was a girl in my town who became known for being with a lot of men. At first it was just her boyfriend. Then it escalated to new ones all the time, even married men. At the local coffee bar, the only place in town that sold ice cream, men would talk openly about her, which was shocking to me at 10 years old since she was only 18 or 19 and I had known her forever. My friends and I would talk about it sometimes, though we didn't understand much back then. We were more into soccer and marbles than relationships. We just figured she was being treated badly, since her boyfriends often argued with her publicly when they found out she was seeing others. There was a lot of drama. One day when I was about 12, I saw her crying alone on a bench in the park. I asked if she needed help, and she confided something shocking. She told me she knew she was seen as the town's mistake. Everyone talked about her, but nobody cared about her as a person. She said it all started after she was assaulted by her father years earlier, and she never found comfort afterward. Without a mother and with no support, she spiraled. She named many men in town, some I even knew, people with families and kids. I went home distressed and told my mom. She was baffled, never knowing the reason behind the girl's dramatic change. My dad was equally shocked, especially since some of the men involved were his acquaintances. The next morning, my mom told me the girl had taken poison and passed away. Her funeral was nearly empty, and soon after, no one ever mentioned her again. At the coffee bar, her name vanished. But among my friends, we never forgot. Many of them grew to resent their fathers once they realized what had happened, and some even felt betrayed by their mothers for ignoring it. The girl's family eventually left town, and her father was never charged. To this day, I think of her. The pain she suffered influenced me to work with youth in my community, helping them feel heard and supported so they don't end up lost like she did. It's heartbreaking to realize how many teens just need someone to truly listen. Story 20. This may not compare to some stories, but it still shook me. I got a call from an animal rescue saying they had found my cat abandoned outside. This was a cat I had originally rescued and then adopted out years before to someone I thought was my best friend. It turns out she had basically put the cat out to live outdoors after she ghosted me. No explanation, no reason, just gone. Her next-door neighbor confirmed the cat had been outside for months, even through below freezing temperatures. The neighbor finally took the cat in when it looked deathly ill in December. They scanned the microchip, which was still registered to me. To make matters worse, we all knew from day one the cat had FIV. Getting that call was shocking. I couldn't believe someone I trusted would do that, not only to me, but to a defenseless animal. The whole experience was so painful that I had to go to therapy to process it. It still hurts, but I hold on to the fact that at least the cat was saved. Sending love to anyone who's gone through things even harder than this. Story 21. After she passed away, I found out my grandmother had been born into a French aristocratic family in Louisiana, plantation owners with wealth spread across the South. But I also learned that when she was around 5 to 10 years old, her older brother caused the death of their grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, by bathing her in ice water and giving her pneumonia. He then took the entire family fortune and moved to Israel, where I presume his descendants continued to profit from land and money in questionable ways. My grandma died in her late 80s over 30 years ago, so all this would have happened in the early 1900s. She spent the rest of her life in poverty, passing away in a trailer park. We also think my grandfather may have been descended from someone enslaved on that plantation who took her in after her mother died. Either way, when my brother did a DNA test a few years ago, we discovered we have both Bantu and Jewish ancestry. On the other side of the family, my grandfather invented the refillable pen, but sold the patent for just $50. After my grandma died, we even found the original prototype among her belongings, but it later disappeared and no one knows where it went. Story 22. I was friends with a widower in my neighborhood who was nearing 80. He often reminisced about his earlier years, working in nuclear engineering, dancing, driving around with his buddies, and above all, his wife. He adored her. He would talk about how smart, beautiful, and vibrant she was, how she lit up every room, and how she was his soulmate. He said she had died of cancer in her 40s, and he never met anyone like her again. They'd had a son who, according to him, died in a car crash at 23. Even decades later, he spoke about it with visible grief. But when he passed away, a middle-aged man came to help clean things up. It turned out this man was his son, very much alive. And his mother, too, was alive. She hadn't died of cancer at all. She had divorced my friend. Rather than face that loss, he created a story in which his wife and son were gone. When his son refused to go along with the lie, he cut him out of his life and added his death to the story. I guess it was easier for him to live as though they had died than to accept that his wife no longer loved him. Story 23. About 25 years ago, one of my friends died in a house fire. He'd been staying with another friend at that friend's mother's house. For weeks, we all thought the fire was just a tragic accident. The surviving friend even stayed at my house, which was kind of a gathering spot back then. Our friend group hugged and comforted him as he told stories of heroically getting his mom out first and then trying to go back for our friend. But the smoke and flames were too much. Then one day the police showed up and arrested him. They also took me and my husband to the station for questioning since he'd been staying with us. We were grilled for hours about him, the fire, and what we knew. It was terrifying, but eventually they realized we were innocent. As it turned out, he and his mom had burned their own house down for insurance money. They thought adding the death of his best friend in the world would make the story more convincing. He had actually killed our friend and committed arson for what would have been about $20,000 after the mortgage was paid off. He stayed in jail and never made bond, where he still remains today. Honestly, had he bonded out, I don't think he would have survived long. Our group was tight, and we were a very vindictive bunch back then. Story 24. I briefly dated a guy, a longtime friend of a friend, who seemed nice and outgoing. He seemed genuinely interested in me, but I didn't feel a spark, so I ended things. About 15 years later, my old friend who introduced us called me in shock. That guy had been arrested for creating and distributing illegal material involving his stepdaughter and other young girls. He was convicted on many counts and will likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Speaking of prison, I once knew a woman who turned out to be a very successful scammer. She ended up serving a couple of years after defrauding friends and acquaintances out of hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. Eventually, people started connecting the dots and everything unraveled. Nearly every part of her life was a lie: her job, her education, even health conditions she claimed to have. She explained away inconsistencies by blaming the illness she never actually had. Apparently, she had done this in multiple cities, moving on whenever her scams collapsed. Story 25. I loved my dad, yet life with him carried shadows I could never quite escape. For years, I tried to convince myself that I was being too sensitive, that maybe I had imagined the weight of it all. Still, the unease lingered, impossible to dismiss. His choices sometimes created an atmosphere that felt confusing and out of place, leaving me unsettled in ways I couldn't explain. Even at school, echoes of his influence followed me, leading to moments where I stood out for reasons I hadn't chosen. As time passed, the strain deepened. Our relationship grew heavier, sometimes boiling over into scenes that left me shaken. Once, a simple moment of laughter during chore turned into a reminder that joy itself wasn't always welcome in his presence. He treated my brother the same way, but my brother seems to remember nothing negative and even lectures me about being unfair to our dad, because in his eyes, he was a good father. Yet I have memories of my dad angrily shoving food into my toddler brother's mouth while my mom cried and yelled that he was going to choke him. Just one example. My father passed away recently and I was devastated. I'd gone to therapy and done a lot of work on forgiving him and moving on, but the memories keep surfacing. That's why I feel such conflicted gratitude when people offer condolences. Everyone agrees he was a friendly, kind, always helpful neighbor, a happy, quirky guy who brought joy to others. I just said thank you, but inside I wanted to scream, "You know he choked me once? Called me too stupid to ever be a doctor, too ugly to ever marry, and told me anything he wanted for his grandkids should go to my brother because I'd never have kids?" When I announced my first pregnancy, he told my mom, "I'll believe it when I see it," and walked outside. Yet still, I say thank you when people tell me how much they loved him. I think they would all be shocked to know the truth. Story 26. I don't know what the most shocking thing I've experienced is, but this one stands out. I once had a hairstylist who seemed perfectly nice. She was skilled, professional, and had a clean, welcoming salon. We'd chat while she worked, and over time I got to know her. One day she mentioned that she had just gotten engaged and was really excited. We talked about her wedding plans, and she admitted she was a bit overwhelmed. I asked what her fiancé did for a living, and she said he was between jobs, which happens. Then I asked how they met. She told me she had been driving one afternoon and saw a homeless man passed out on the street. She said he looked like he needed a friend, so she picked him up, put him in the back seat of her car, drove him home, and he never left. Now they were getting married. I was floored. Maybe it sounds judgmental, but I never went back. If someone is responsible for the health of my scalp, I need to trust their judgment completely. And after hearing that, I just couldn't. Story 27. My dad might have been a close call for serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. At the time, my dad was young, fit, and the picture of the classic all-American man. He and a friend were hitchhiking through an area that later became infamous as Dahmer's hunting grounds. They got picked up by a stranger, possibly Dahmer himself. My dad sat in the front seat and fell asleep, while his friend sat in the back. That's when the man tried to make an unwanted move on his friend. The friend screamed, waking my dad. My dad immediately pinned the guy down and threatened to smash his head through the window if he didn't pull over and let them out. The man complied, dropping them off before speeding away. Years later, when Dahmer was caught, my dad saw the younger photos of him on the news and recognized the face. He's convinced it was Dahmer, or someone who looked exactly like him. The detail that always chills me is that my dad recognized the younger Dahmer, not the older photos circulating at the time. It makes me wonder if my dad was part of an early trial run, teaching Dahmer who he could or couldn't target. Because as history showed, Dahmer often chose victims from marginalized groups who couldn't fight back, while men like my dad were ignored by authorities. Story 28. My husband and I were watching the news when a Crime Stoppers segment came on. They reported a recent string of 16 convenience store robberies and showed video of the suspect. The footage showed a man holding up a gas station, bandana over his face until it slipped. Clear as day, it was our neighbor friend Trey, who had just been at our house 15 minutes earlier, borrowing a power cord. 20 minutes later, the neighborhood was full of police. When questioned, his girlfriend insisted it wasn't him, saying her boyfriend had her name tattooed on his face, and the robber didn't. That was a lie. Before talking to police, he actually went and got her name tattooed on his face to prove it wasn't him. He still ended up serving 6 years. Story 29. I found out in my early 40s through friends that my parents had been swingers back when I was about 9 to 12 years old in the late 70s to early 80s. We had a nice house with a basement, bar, pool table, stereo system, and one locked special room. My brother and I were told it had exercise equipment, and we were never allowed inside. About once a month, they'd host parties with lots of guests, and we'd be sent to stay at friends' houses. Later, I asked my mom about it, and she admitted it. She didn't go into detail, thankfully, but she said they quit because Dad got jealous. He wasn't getting as much attention as Mom was. Eventually, they cleared out the room and converted it into a bedroom for me, complete with a shower. I was relieved I didn't find out until later in life, though it still creeps me out. Most of my friends apparently knew but never told me. Even now, it feels unsettling to think about. Story 30. Very close family friends. My mom was the maid of honor at their wedding. She threw my baby shower last year, and both my sister and I babysat her son. Within the last 3 months, we found out that her son was a serial predator. The FBI arrested him for soliciting a minor over Fortnite. At the time, the count was at least 40 victims, plus charges for producing abusive material. And it all went back years. He had started at just 13 years old by targeting younger kids in his karate class. We had no idea. His family hid everything, refused to acknowledge there was a problem, and even kept him in activities that gave him access to kids. After he was expelled from karate, they let him become a camp counselor, where he was fired for being inappropriate again. Piecing it all together has been insane. Just this morning, my husband ran into his father at a gas station and said he couldn't even look at him without fear of losing control. He's now facing 30 years in prison, and honestly, I hope justice is fully served. Story 31. I was estranged from my father for 10 years, so there are plenty of things about his life I didn't know. But this story is about his neighbor. When I visited my dad, I met the neighbor, a friend of his. Picture two grumpy old Navy men in their mid-70s in a British city. The neighbor seemed kind and was genuinely excited to meet me, especially since my dad had told him I was a marine biologist. The next time I visited, the neighbor wasn't around, but my dad handed me a gift from him. It was a handmade navy blue leather-bound notebook, embossed with an anchor in the words nautical notes. I was touched and thanked my dad, but I couldn't help wondering how his neighbor had learned to make something so beautiful. That's when my dad explained. The neighbor had been in prison from the age of 21 until just a few years before I met him. While incarcerated, he had learned many skills, including leatherworking. Naturally, I asked why he had gone to prison. My dad told me the neighbor had killed his father. Apparently, his father had been an abusive drunk who mistreated the family. One day during an argument, things escalated and the neighbor shoved him. His father fell, hit his head on the fireplace, and died. Hearing this didn't change how I saw him. To me, he seemed like a man who had paid for his mistakes and turned his life around. He passed away a few years ago, but I still have that notebook, and the story behind it has always stayed with me. Story 32. I grew up with only my mother. I was never allowed to ask questions about my father and would get in big trouble if I was caught talking about him with other kids. Still, my mother always encouraged me to write him letters, make drawings, and send birthday cards. She always said he would come back one day. I believed her until my late teens, when it hurt too much, and I finally gave up. In my late 20s, during a bad reaction to one of her medications, she had a mental break and blurted out the truth. She said all the secrecy was because she had gotten pregnant with me while he was married, and she didn't want anyone who knew him to overhear. She never directly told me who he was, and by then, I wasn't sure I even wanted to know. But she hinted enough that I pieced together it was a man who had been around a lot when I was very young and then vanished. When I was 43, my aunt told me he had died, not as my father, just as my mother's old friend. I looked up his obituary. He had divorced a few years before his death, and the obituary actually named my mother as his oldest and dearest friend. So I guess they stayed connected if they had ever truly stopped. I checked Facebook and found all these pictures of them together at family events with his sons, my half-brothers. I was never acknowledged by him, and I never confronted my mother about it. She had always been difficult, but this revelation was by far the most shocking. Story 33. I used to work at a university for many years. When my department moved to the main campus building, I often visited the building's convenience and stationery store and became friendly with the staff. One day, while Googling an old acquaintance, someone who had once been the head of a club I belonged to, but later was charged with massive fraud, harassment, and stalking, I stumbled across something even more shocking. In another section of the crime page, I saw the name of my acquaintance who had worked at that store. Decades earlier, her daughter had been kidnapped and killed by a serial predator. Her body was never found. Over the years, the man repeatedly lied about where he buried her, keeping the family in endless grief. The article explained he was now dying, still refusing to reveal the real location. Reading that broke me. I had chatted casually with this woman for years, never knowing the kind of nightmare she had lived through. Story 34. My best friend in middle school had what seemed like the perfect family. Her mom was a loving stay-at-home parent, her dad a high-ranking government engineer, and they lived in a 4-story house. Eventually, they moved away, and so did I. We lost touch. Years later, out of curiosity, I Googled her, and what I found shattered me. Her dad had been arrested for hiding cameras in the bathroom and secretly recording his kids and their friends. He had distributed the footage online. The FBI caught him after he was exposed in an online group where he was asked to provide a video for verification. In court, the judge called him one of the most disturbing individuals they had ever encountered. He is now serving life in federal prison. I cried so much when I found out. I felt horrible for my friend, her siblings, and her mom, who were blindsided. The kids adored their dad, and he betrayed them in the worst way imaginable. The victims were all minors, and all of the footage came from their home. No one knows how long it had been going on. I'll never know if his crimes overlapped with the time I knew her. I had countless sleepovers there, shared meals at their table, and now wonder if I was unknowingly near that darkness. The irony is that he was a cybersecurity engineer with top secret clearance. Yet he was caught online, the same way he betrayed his family. Story 35. I used to rent out part of a comic book store to buy, sell, and trade magic. The gathering cards as a side hustle. Another guy handled the other card games, and he was pretty nice. I got to know him since we'd sometimes trade when one of us had cards the other needed. He was a little odd, but in a comic book store, that was normal. Eventually, the store was sold to a friend of mine who wanted to run everything himself, so I didn't talk to the guy for a few months. About 6 months later, I got a collection of cards I didn't normally buy and gave him a call. No answer. That weekend, I ran into another friend of his who told me he had been arrested and charged with extortion. Apparently, he had made fake accounts on social media, flirted with girls, convinced them to send photos, and then blackmailed them with threats to release those photos unless they did what he wanted. Since it was online, the government made an example out of him in one of the first major cyber extortion cases, and he was sentenced to 17.5 years. Some of the girls were underage at the time, which made his charges even more serious. I've known a lot of eccentric people, but I never expected him to be running something like that. It was a shock, to say the least. Story 36. After my parents separated when I was about 3 or 4, my mom moved in with a female coworker who quickly became very close to us. They didn't just live together, they commuted to work together when their shifts lined up, hung out with the same friends, and she even helped take care of me. She'd bring me to school when my mom was working late or resting, and she often helped me with math homework, since my mom wasn't great at math. Because of their custody agreement, I spent half of my life with my mom, and this woman was part of that half in nearly every way. She even helped support us when my mom had to take time off work to care for my grandmother at the end of her life. We were always together, but they also argued a lot, usually petty disagreements, from what I remember. After about 5 to 6 years, they decided to live in separate apartments, though still in the same complex. Eventually, the woman moved back to her home state to be with family. Before she left, she stopped by our apartment one last time. She cried a little, hugged me tightly, and said goodbye. I didn't fully grasp how emotional it was back then. Years later, we had a reunion phone call with her. My mom, my older brother, and I were talking when my mom casually said, "We fought a lot, but we had so many good times when we were together." I blurted out, "You two fought more than any other friends I've ever known." My mom and brother just looked at me with puzzled expressions. That's when it finally dawned on me. 2 women who lived together in one apartment, shared a bed, split bills, raised a child together, worked together, and spent all their free time together, were not just friends. I was about 16 when I realized it, and we all laughed about how oblivious I had been. Story 37. I had an older friend who was like a brother to me around the time I graduated high school. We lived next door to each other and even ran a small business together. This was on a compound, large workplace, not a cult, in a tourist town. Every summer, young people from ages 16 to 30 would live and work there. We often became friends with them, and some turned into relationships. For context, I married one of them, and we've been together for over 20 years now. One summer, a girl showed up and quickly hit it off with my friend. I had already seen him date people who were far too young for him, but she left after a few weeks to return to school. Later, he admitted to me that he felt guilty because he went too far while they were making out. Not long after, I moved away and stopped seeing him. Years later, I ran into that girl at work. She cornered me almost immediately and told me that my friend had assaulted her. She also told me she was much younger than I had remembered, only 16 at the time. Thinking back on what he had said, I believe she was telling the truth. I didn't handle the conversation well, but I felt that if what she said was true, then he deserved to be held accountable. Strangely enough, her work schedule changed and she had to quit the next week, so I never got closure. The hardest part was the contradiction. I know that same guy later helped another victim of assault get justice in court, even testifying as a witness. It's a confusing mix of good and evil that I'll never be able to wrap my head around. Story 38. A while back, I was part of a large friend group. One girl, let's call her A, was the life of the party type, loud, funny, and full of dramatic stories. Everyone seemed to like her, but I always got strange vibes. I was polite but never close. My friend B, however, became close with her and another girl, C. They formed their own trio. A and C eventually moved in together. A always claimed she was a lawyer, but said she wasn't practicing because she couldn't afford to renew her license in our state. C believed her until her workplace needed legal help. A pretended she had renewed her license, even borrowing money from friends to make it believable, and started working on a case. Around the same time, a local bar owner asked her to help with legal paperwork too. But something didn't add up. Another lawyer noticed inconsistencies and looked her up. Turns out she was never a lawyer at all. She had fabricated the entire story. When C dug deeper, she discovered A had also stolen her credit cards, borrowed money under false pretenses, and scammed multiple people in the group. Over time, it came out that A had lied, stolen, and manipulated almost everyone she knew. The bar owner eventually exposed her on Facebook, which set off a storm of anger. AI had a breakdown, attempted something drastic, was hospitalized briefly, then disappeared. She resurfaced only briefly before moving to another state, where she went completely off the grid. The wildest part? Her own older sister was part of our group and admitted A had done the same things to her. To this day, none of us bring up her name, though there are enough stories to fill a book. Legal action was taken, and there's still a warrant out for her arrest. Story 39. About 6 months ago, I found out a former friend had gone to prison for being in a relationship with someone underage. She was 35, and he had just turned 18, but apparently their relationship started when he was 15. She claimed she hadn't known his age at first, but even after she found out, they continued. There were also rumors she had supplied him with drugs and alcohol. The news hit me hard because I had known her for years. When I first met her, I was 18 and she was 27. At the time, she was with a violent drug dealer who once pulled a gun on me during a paranoid episode. I distanced myself from her after that, but before I did, they constantly pressured me for things I wasn't comfortable with. Looking back, I don't think she started out as a predator. I think she was broken down by years of abuse and substance use in that earlier relationship, and she repeated that cycle with someone younger when he pursued her. It doesn't excuse it, it's awful, but it's why I think it happened. What made it worse for me was that, despite her issues, she had been a loyal friend to me personally. She always supported me and never spoke badly about me. So when I heard about her arrest, I had panic attacks for weeks. It threw me for a huge loop and forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about her. Story 40. Years ago, I lived in a small Midwestern town where people still left their doors unlocked and their car keys in the ignition. After a friend's daughter's wedding, everyone gathered at the local bar to celebrate. I left early, but later I heard what happened with one of my friends. She had been at the bar with her girlfriend, but ended up stranded when her girlfriend left without her. Her phone had died, and since she lived 2 towns away, a 20-minute drive, her only option seemed to be walking home. Problem was, it was 3 a.m., she was drunk, and there was no way she was making it that far on foot. She made it as far as a trailer park on the edge of town, where she started checking vehicles. She found a pickup truck with the keys in the ignition, stole it, and drove herself home. She ditched the truck at the Moose Lodge parking lot just a few blocks from her house. The theft hit the police blotter, noting the truck had been recovered. Later, the full story came out. She hadn't stayed at the bar because of her girlfriend. She'd been chasing a side piece. She tried convincing some of our friends to take her to see this woman, but they refused. Angry, she left with a bunch of guys and went out drinking whiskey in the country. By the time someone brought her back to the bar, everyone else had gone home. Stranded because of her own choices, she decided to steal a ride. Needless to say, that was the end of my friendship with her. Story 41. I was in a band for 11 years, and the guys in it became my closest friends. Even as we grew older, moved for jobs, or started families, we stayed tight. We had group chats across multiple platforms, talked every day, and made time for long drives just to meet up, party, and hang out. When the band ended, the friendships didn't. We still spoke daily and organized regular gatherings. Then about 5 years ago, one of the guys suddenly went silent. He stopped replying to chats, never showed up to anything, and I couldn't reach him. Soon after, I learned he had been arrested for physically abusing his girlfriend and their newborn daughter. At first, I didn't believe it, but he eventually pleaded guilty on all counts and spent 3 years in prison. For me, that was the end. I completely cut him out of my life. But when he was released, the rest of the guys welcomed him back like nothing had happened. I couldn't understand it. After months of heated arguments about it, I finally told them that if they could look past something that horrific, call it a mistake, and let him back in, then I couldn't remain part of the group. I walked away, and I haven't spoken to any of them since. Discovering what he had done was awful, but realizing my closest friends could forgive and forget something so terrible felt just as devastating. Story 42. I lost my mom when I was 5, for most of my childhood, up until around 17 or 18. I believe she had died of liver failure, something beyond anyone's control. I grew up thinking life had just taken its course. Then one day, while applying for a new passport with my dad, I ended up holding some of his paperwork. Among the stack was her death certificate. Out of curiosity, I read it. That's when I saw the words, "Cause of death, contact gunshot, wound to the head." It took weeks for me to process what that meant. Eventually, I worked up the courage to ask my dad. That's when he told me the truth. She had been struggling, drinking heavily, and ended her own life. I was just 5 when she died, so my memories of her are those of a child, warm, loving, and full of life. Nothing about those memories lined up with the reality of someone so lost inside themselves that they could make such a choice. I'll always love her deeply, but part of me can't forgive her for leaving my brother and me without a mom. To me, suicide feels like the most selfish act a person can commit, no matter the reason. It left us with a hole that could never be filled. I've only shared this with a few people in my life, so even writing it out here feels strangely freeing, like letting go of a secret I've carried for far too long. Story 43. This one is a long walk, but worth it. Back in kindergarten, I had a friend, A. We drifted apart for a few years, but reconnected in high school and became inseparable. Even through college, we were close. Afterward, though, he started flaking on me, and even on his job. I found out from his boss that he was missing shifts constantly. One night, I had concert tickets for us, but he just disappeared. I ended up going with another friend, who later became my girlfriend. After that, I gave up trying to keep the friendship alive. A few years later, I ran into him at a bar. He apologized, saying he'd been in a dark place, but didn't elaborate. Later, I learned from a mutual friend that he'd been into hard drugs. His wealthy parents would send him on rehab vacations in Cuba whenever things got too bad. That was twist number 1. Twist number 2 came later. His dad was arrested for gang activity. It turned out his dad was the mob's accountant. The family's wealth came directly from organized crime, and when he was caught, all their assets, including their home, were seized. Suddenly, the whole picture made sense in a way I never could have imagined back in kindergarten. Story 44. Several years ago, one of my coworkers, who is also a dear friend, had to move out of their home due to financial struggles. They told me that during this period, they and their mother were staying with relatives. But because the house was cramped, they tried to be out as much as possible. Around that time, I noticed my friends' clothes sometimes looked a bit dirty, and there was a faint smell on them. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being judgmental. After all, this person was, and still is, one of the kindest, most positive people I know. Always cheerful, helpful, optimistic, like SpongeBob in human form. You never would have guessed they were struggling so much. Then one day at work, they got a phone call. They'd been approved to rent a nearby house. The relief and joy were overwhelming. They cried tears of happiness right there. We were all celebrating with them when they accidentally let something slip. For weeks, they had been sleeping in their car. While their mother stayed with relatives, they couldn't because there wasn't enough space. They only went to shower, do laundry, and grab food occasionally. They didn't want to be a burden, and they knew that if we or our bosses had found out, we would have insisted they stay with us. So they kept it quiet. I'll never forget that moment. It was shocking and heartbreaking. This person, one of the most hardworking and genuine people I've ever met, had been enduring homelessness right under our noses. Later, one of my bosses and I cried together, devastated that we hadn't known sooner. We both wished they had told us because we would have done everything we could to help.